Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, has pulled out of a planned visit to Moscow on Monday in the wake of the suspected chemical weapons attack in Syria earlier this week. In a statement, he said he deplored Russia's continued defence of the Assad regime. Our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins, has the story.
This was President Trump's message to the Syrian government and its Russian backers yesterday, delivered with force. The United States and her allies reject Syrian denials. They used a chemical weapon against civilians, including children. Now Britain has followed up with a diplomatic rebuke. Boris Johnson has called off talks in Moscow on Monday and issued a written statement instead.
Developments in Syria have changed the situation fundamentally. We deplore Russia's continued defence of the Assad regime, even after the chemical weapons attack on innocent civilians. We call on Russia to do everything possible to bring about a political settlement in Syria to ensure that the shocking events of last week are never repeated.
The planned visit by Boris Johnson to Moscow would have been the first by any British Foreign Secretary for 5 years. A long gap reflecting the very bad relationship between Britain and Russia, which already existed. But the events of the past week in Syria have now provoked an even deeper crisis. Russia's first response came in this tweet from their embassy in London, accusing Boris Johnson of theatrics for lack of argument and inviting people to listen instead to what they call Russia's soft power. A link leads to this excerpt from Tchaikovsky's patriotic 1812 overture, celebrating past Russian military victory. Instead of seeing the Russians on Monday, Boris Johnson will be in Italy, talking to America's Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and other allies, including Germany.
The attack by the United States is understandable, given the extent of the war crime, the suffering of innocent people, and the blockade in the UN Security Council.
And that message will be reinforced when Mr. Tillerson, not Boris Johnson, goes to Moscow in the middle of next week for what will be a very tough encounter between Russia and the United States. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has cancelled a planned trip to Moscow tomorrow, saying Russia's continued defence of President Assad after the chemical weapons attack was deplorable. Mr. Johnson said the situation had changed fundamentally. Today, Russian and Syrian warplanes were still targeting the same area of Idlib province, which was struck by the chemical attack. Here's Jane Dodge.
People searched the rubble close to the town of Han Shikun in northwest Syria. 4 days ago, chemical weapons were dropped on nearby houses. But this damage has been caused since then. Yesterday, warplanes returned. This time, it was the Russians, according to local activists.
At 3:40, a warplane hit. The first bomb fell on the clinic. Because it was so loud, we thought it was chlorine. While we were walking to the clinic, a second missile hit. At least 15 homes were destroyed.
Little evidence then that Donald Trump's cruise missiles have made President Assad pause for thought, let alone stop his military campaign. Mr. Trump said it was the images of the victims of the chemical attack, particularly the children, that had persuaded him to take action. Abdel Hamid al-Yusuf lost his twins and his wife. He says Mr. Trump didn't go far enough.
We thought he would strike all the air bases, but he only struck one. Striking one is not enough. There are more than 20 air bases in Syria.
Aerial photographs released by the Pentagon show damaged aircraft bunkers at Shirat Air Base. It's the second biggest in Syria. At least one burnt-out aircraft was evident during a visit by Syria's military top brass. But planes are still able to take off from one of the runways and are continuing to carry out attacks on rebel-held areas.
My fellow Americans.
In his weekly address, Mr. Trump talked of the importance of international partnerships, not quite the isolationist that many had thought they'd voted for. He didn't mention Syria or Russia by name, but they weren't far from his thoughts.
Our decisions will be guided by our values and our goals, and we will reject the path of inflexible ideology that too often leads to unintended consequences.
Boris Johnson has shown no such reticence about naming names. Last month it was announced he'd be visiting Russia, the first such trip by a British foreign minister in 5 years. Today it was all off. In a statement he said, "We deplore Russia's continued defence of the Assad regime even after the chemical weapons attack on innocent civilians. We call on Russia to ensure that the shocking events of the last week are never repeated." Pro-Assad supporters marched to the United Nations office in Damascus today. The Syrian government continues to deny responsibility for the chemical attack. Russia has accused the US of violating international law.
This sit-in sends a message to Trump, to America and to the whole world that we will be steadfast despite their attacks. We've been in this for 6 years and we will continue like this.
The G7 countries will discuss Syria and the worsening relationship between the two superpowers next week. The US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson will then visit Moscow to deliver what he's described as a clear and coordinated message to the Russians.
Sunday Times there, Russia accused of complicity in Syria, war crime, a very good read-through there. But also note the verb in the sentence here, Boris Johnson told to call off Moscow mission. We're talking to that, and very different views of Boris Johnson in the papers. Different views of Boris Johnson. There's the Sunday Telegraph. Boris, Russia must leave Syria, sounding very, very statesmanlike and foreign secretary-like there. But look at the front of the Mail on Sunday. Boris the Poodle pulls out of Russia summit. Why has he, at the very last minute, not gone to Moscow as he was going to do? Sir Peter Westmacott, great to have you here this weekend of all weekends.
Thank you.
And I'm going to pick up on that Boris story. I showed the front page, very aggressive, and there's a big spread inside, Moscow attacking him, mocking him for not coming and all that.
Yep, lots of stuff here about that story, and the Russians saying that he's indulging in theatrics for lack of any argument, so not terribly good in terms of the optics coming out of Moscow. But I think there's a broader issue here, which is what is the role of the British government in this whole business of what's been going on with Syria. There was number 10 on Wednesday morning saying nobody's taking any military action. And by Thursday evening, the next day, there was the president talking to people, and there were senior Americans actually conferring with their British partners, so let's be honest about that, about what was going to happen. But they didn't ask us to get involved like they did 4 years ago. And here is the question of what is Boris's role? Should he go, should he not go? Was he told not to go, or was it felt that it was actually more intelligent to leave it to Rex Tillerson, who's going to Moscow, of course, this week as well, to carry all the water?
Boris Johnson is quoted, one of his people is quoted in one of the papers saying he knows that the politics behind this will look terrible this morning, but that doesn't matter in terms of getting a smooth message from the West to Moscow.
Yes, there may be an element of making the best of a bad job in that kind of line, but there we are. And it's striking also, I think, that both on television and in terms of the op-eds, it is Michael Fallon who has been making the government's case on all this, much of which is about, frankly, foreign policy.
Do we think the Foreign Secretary is being gagged at the moment, Phil Collins?
It does look like it. I mean, as Peter says, Michael Fallon is everywhere, and Boris Johnson is just footage of him walking up and down, and lots of speculation about whether he's been told to step out. I mean, there are voices from the government in the newspapers. I mean, Michael Gove's got a piece in The Sun. Might is right.
He's not in the government last time I looked.
Well, he's on his way back if he gets his way. But what we've not got anywhere is what Boris thinks about this.
Now, we're going to go to the iPad for the New York Times, I think. Sir Peter, you've got that there.
Well, there's another angle to this, which is an interesting article by Charlie Savage in the New York Times, which is, was this all legal or not? And there's a long debate which goes on as to whether this is legal to strike the Syrians under international law, and then there's a debate under US law, and then there's a debate about whether it was constitutional or not.
Because the American excuse, if you need an excuse for something like this, was that this related to terrorism, which therefore made it a self-defensive attack, which is quite intricate in terms of its explanation.
Quite intricate, and I think Charlie goes through the arguments. Quite hard to argue that this is actually consistent with self-defense. On the other hand, there's plenty of precedent for American presidents taking military action when they haven't been able to argue self-defense. And there's plenty of precedent also with not consulting Congress, which is the other big, if you like, legal and procedural issue which Trump had to address before taking this decision.
All of it is a nonsense, though. Western democracies deciding whether something's legal. This notion about international law, when it's being decided effectively by whether Russia and China agree with it. I'm sorry, I do not decide whether something is the right thing to do based on what totalitarian dictatorships think. I'm so sorry.
But we are also in this slightly strange position where it's apparently OK to destroy people's lives with barrel bombs, but if you use gas, that's crossing a red line.
The legal difference is very clear in terms of international law, but the moral difference, if it was my child that had been blown up or had been killed in a chemical attack, I'm not sure if I was a Syrian mum, I would be ready to make that fine distinction about one thing is just, well, carry on killing Syrian children every day, targeting them, and then suddenly we're outraged.
I think the other pertinent question here is whether we know that Assad carried this out.
That is a very good question. Do we think we know this?
Well, Dominic Lawson's got a very good piece in the Sunday Times in which he goes through the incapacity of Russia these days to lie effectively. He goes through that once upon a time the Russians were fantastic liars, and he goes through in great detail how their lies now are just so easy to decipher. Yes. So it's a very persuasive piece that actually we do know.
And of course, looking ahead, Julia, the real question is whether this is a dry run for North Korea, a much more dangerous situation in global terms.
Yeah, well, indeed. I mean, Trump had made it very clear in a number of his tweets that, North Korea was his priority, not Syria. Sod the people of Syria, not our problem in the Middle East. He's said that long before he was president and since. But yes, North Korea, he's made it a big issue. And this is, I think, the worry for the world, which is, A, they have nuclear weapons, forget, barrel bombs or chemical weapons, and B, you've got two huge egomaniacs trying to deal with each other. And Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, I would not want to be caught in the middle of that one. And the question is this going to be, well, again, like with this bolt-fast and American policy on Syria, is this going to be something that's decided strategically with long-term military precision or diplomatic precision, or is this just going to be done on a whim by two egomaniacs? And I genuinely think we are in very, very dangerous waters.
There is a North Korea angle to this. I'm not convinced that it was in Donald Trump's mind when he did his flip-flop and changed his mind so suddenly. This was about not being Obama. This was about being a decisive president. This was about being a bit unpredictable. This was about showing that I am in charge now and I can smack the bad guys. I think there is a separate message to the North Koreans, which is indeed, as Obama said to him during the transition, the biggest single national security issue threatening America. But I'm not sure that was in his mind. There was an Ivanka angle and there was a media angle. He saw the pictures and he decided, I've got to do something.
And what we're seeing here also is a big reshaping of Trump's team in America as well. People coming up, people coming down. Steve Bannon, the boss of Breitbart, who everyone thought was the real hawk at his shoulder, is not a hawk on this issue and has flown off a little bit.
That's right. It's in all the papers. I mean, the Mail speculates on whether Ivanka was very important, but in the Telegraph it goes hardest on the fighting in the White House and suggests that some of the top advisors could even be sacked over this. As you say, Steve Bannon, who was taken off the National Security Council last week, he thinks that none of this fits with America First, his slogan. And Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, is apparently becoming much more of a potent force within the White House.
And this attack has infuriated a lot of the hardest core Trump supporters in America who thought they weren't going to get involved in these wars ever again and are really angry this morning.
Well, now, in a deliberate echo of presidential phrases, Russia, Iran and Hezbollah today issued a joint statement condemning the US missile strike in Syria as having crossed a red line. They also said their support for the Syrian military would increase and they would, quote, respond to any aggression. As the Kremlin ratchets up the rhetoric against the United States, it's also dismissing news that Boris Johnson has cancelled a planned visit to Moscow, saying the British Foreign Secretary had no influence. Here's Jane Dodge.
This is what happens if you cross President Trump's red line. He used 59 cruise missiles to get his message across, targeting Shayrat Air Base, where the US claimed planes carrying the chemical weapons involved in Tuesday's attack were based. The Syrians have denied responsibility. This government spokesman told Russian TV, if we really had them, all our soldiers here would have been dead after the American attack. Now, Syria's allies, Russia, Iran and Lebanon's Hezbollah group, have accused Mr. Trump of crossing their red line. Speaking during a ceremony for Iran's National Day of Nuclear Technology, The president said the attack was illegal and accused the US of invading Syria.
How does the US president allow himself to attack an independent country in the sensitive region of the Middle East without the permission of the United Nations, without a meeting of the UN Security Council, and even without the permission of the US Congress?
We're finished.
This current crisis is a stark contrast to the climate of cooperation back in 2013. Russia and the US agreed a deal on the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons. UN inspectors oversaw the process, with President Assad supposedly in agreement. Tuesday's attack, which killed more than 80 people, many of them children, has left that 2013 deal in tatters, and the British blaming the Russians. Writing in the Sunday Times, the Defence Secretary Sir Michael Fallon said, "By proxy, Russia is responsible for every civilian death last week. If Russia wants to be absolved of responsibility for future attacks, Vladimir Putin needs to enforce commitments to dismantle Assad's chemical weapons arsenal for good." But the tone couldn't have been more different from the US Secretary of State. With talks in Moscow later this week, no doubt, in mind, his language was far more conciliatory.
I don't draw conclusions of complicity at all, but clearly they've been incompetent, and perhaps they've just simply been outmaneuvered by the Syrians.
The Foreign Secretary felt it best to leave any talking to the Russians up to the Americans. But his decision to cancel his trip to Moscow tomorrow has angered his hosts. In a tweet, the Russian embassy described it as deplorable, alongside a painting showing the charge of the Light Brigade, when British cavalrymen were slaughtered by the Russians in Crimea. This girl reads out the names of her relatives who died in the chemical attack on Khan Sheikhoun. She lost 26 in total. Those in the family who survived feel the Americans have already lost interest in their future.
The Trump attack is like a TV series mocking Syrians. For 24 hours, they talked about nothing but Syria. But today, there's nothing.
As the two superpowers focus their minds on what happens next, the bombing continues. There was fierce shelling in the southern province of Deraa today. Rebels, Syrian government forces and the Islamic State are all fighting for territory here.
Well, I'm joined now from Hawley in Surrey by the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Crispin Blunt, and via internet from Moscow in a moment or two by Dmitry Babich from Sputnik News. Crispin Blunt, first of all, alarming noise here from the joint operation of Russia, Syria and Hezbollah, but it's just noise, isn't it? The real action is what happens with the foreign ministers coming up in Moscow. That's where the game's at now.
No, that's correct. And what they're allowing to happen is a confusion about two things. The American action was solely about the breach of the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's a one-off reprisal for the use of chemical weapons out of that base. The Americans have said there was no doubt it happened, and they've made clear that that military action was simply about that. And so they used the capability they have with 60 cruise missiles then to attack that base. Separately, Iran, Hezbollah and the Russians are supporting the Assad administration in their civil war. And it's that political process that we've got to focus on now.
And quite legally so. The Russians have a point.
Yes, and quite legally so, but they are conflating the two things quite deliberately because, of course, as far as one can tell, they must be complicit if the Americans, and there is no doubt that the chemical weapon came out from the Syrian government side, and they were supposed to have been disarmed under Russian supervision in 2013, and that plainly hasn't happened. But we need to put the chemical weapon issue in one place and not allow it to ride into the issue of the political process, where we need to get back to the agreement that the international community brokered in November 2015, which saw the route to a political process to get us out of the Syrian civil war.
Well, that is indeed one route, but Damascus, Moscow and indeed Tehran would say, look, we're winning the war. That's the quickest way to end the bloodshed. Let us get on with winning the war. Then we'll talk about Bashar al-Assad. There's something to commend that, frankly, isn't there?
Well, no, this war is not. This war will go on for a very long time, given the hostility of the parties involved. And
well, I mean, Damascus and the Russians are winning it, plainly. Damascus and Russians are winning this war. That is plain on the ground.
They have certainly not under an existential threat now, which makes the use of these chemical weapons rather strange in the circumstances, which is why attribution investigation is very important, so that full culpability of the Syrian regime is established publicly. But there's no sign that the forces that are being supported by a number of other nations in the region, that support is going to come to an end, and that there is a quick way out of this conflict for the Syrian government. They need a settlement just as much as the rebels on the ground do.
Right.
And we need to get back to a political process. And the only caution to be said about the international community is that we don't overreach in terms of our ask and our statement about the future of Assad. That must be a question for the Syrian people.
Well, indeed, that point's taken. But is Michael Fallon right that the Russians are by proxy guilty if, and we don't know for sure, if indeed it was Damascus that mounted a Syrian attack because Russia simply supports militarily A to Z Damascus?
Well, there are two things. A, the Russians support Damascus, but also they were part of a deal in 2013 that was meant to have seen Syria disarmed of its chemical weapons when the United Kingdom and the United States declined to take direct military action if the Russians then disarmed the Syrians, which they said they had done. And so if this weapon was sourced out of the Syrian government, either the Syrians have betrayed the Russians or the Russians have been complicit.
Right. Well, thanks very much for that, Crispin Blunt. And Dmitry Babich in Moscow. Let's take up that point first. Our Defence Secretary saying today, and the government here in the UK very much in agreement, Moscow is complicit with the chemical weapons attack because it obviously supports and upholds militarily everything that Damascus does. That's right, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure that's right. I agree with the previous speaker that it's kind of strange for the government of Bashar al-Assad to use chemical weapons when they're winning the civil war anyway. I mean, this is the worst time for Bashar al-Assad to use chemical weapons because just 2 days ago, Mr. Trump said that, I'm quoting him, we're not fighting Bashar al-Assad, we're fighting ISIS in Syria. So it would be the most stupid thing possibly for Assad to do these chemical weapons. So I agree with the previous speaker that it's kind of illogical. And certainly it's not right to blame Russia for this chemical attack in any way, because Bashar al-Assad was not disarmed by Russia. He was disarmed by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which got Nobel Peace Prize for that in 2013. OPCW is not a Russian organization. It operated under the auspices of the UN, which a lot of countries, not just Russia.
OK, well, I think both sides of you are saying that investigation into what happened remains absolutely crucial. Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed.
I've been getting